Hey everyone, this is my take on how to be an anti-racist by Ibram Kendi, and I'm doing chapter 4, biology. My name is Professor Wellman. I'm an anthropologist at the University of Michigan Dearborn, and one of the things we teach in Introduction to Anthropology is biological racism, and we work to dismantle that concept. So I thought I would take up this chapter, chapter 4, biology. So Kendi starts off the chapter with two definitions. One is the biological racist, or one who is expressing the idea that the races are meaningfully different in their biology and that these differences create a hierarchy of value. And then the other option is the one we want, right? The biological anti-racist, one who is expressing the idea that the races are meaningfully the same in their biology and there are no genetic racial differences. So we're going to look at some of these ideas and how they relate to some of the basic things we go over in Anthropology 101 here at the university. So the first thing that's really important in thinking about race is the way that this worldview was actually invented. And it's not an occurrence throughout history, throughout time. It's something that was invented for a very specific purpose and during colonialism. So racism was invented during the colonial era when peoples of Africa were brought to provide slave labor and Europeans encountered other European settlers and Indians. Race was invented to classify people. It subsumed a growing ideology of inequality devised to rationalize European attitudes and treatment of conquered and enslaved people. It helped establish a rigid hierarchy of socially exclusive categories that bolstered unequal rank and status differences. Here, importantly for this chapter in Kendi's work, is that science was used to confirm these hierarchical differences and justify them. Differences among the racial categories were projected to their greatest extreme with the argument that Africans, Indians, and Europeans are separate species with Africans closer to apes. So there you get the ranking and the different valuing of different racial groups. This ideology was spread to other parts of the world, and it was used to justify slavery. So this is from the American Anthropological Association statement on race. In his book, Kendi actually talks about some of the racist talk that he hears in his life. Things like he acted that way because he's black, she acted that way because she's Asian. Things like black people have more natural physical ability, or that black blood is different from white blood. I'm sure some of you have heard these kind of statements. And what we see is that there are prevalent what anthropologists might call taxonomies of race. And this is how most Americans imagine race. They imagine it as three kind of distinct bubbles with this is a genetic understanding, right? An essentialist concept of race where you've got Africans in one bubble, Europeans in another bubble, and Asians in another bubble. And these are defined according to anatomical features. Individual variations and mixtures between the races are seen as overlapping a little bit, but there is this kind of like idea of pure races. And this is our folk taxonomy. This is how we tend to think about race. This is how we were taught it. It's how we've historically thought about it since this worldview was invented during the era of colonialism. Carl Linnaeus, 18th century, the founder of taxonomy, was part of this invention and its scientific justification. So he classified humans into 4 geographical subspecies: white Europeans, red Americans, brown Asians, which later changed to yellow Asians, and black Africans. This kind of discourse has been used in horrifying ways, not only to justify slavery, but also at Auschwitz, to demonstrate the, quote, degeneration of Jewish and Gypsy blood through the documentation of physical oddities. And it's this kind of idea that race is an essential concept that maps on to biology. And we're going to see that from the perspective of science, new science, biological anthropology, that this is just not the case. None of this is the case. But to do that, we have to see our seeing. So part of it is recognizing your own ideas and how they shape how you see things. And so that's one of the things we try to do in anthropology. And this is exactly what Kendi does. in his book. He writes, "Race is a genetic mirage." And this is actually true. It's not really based in genes. So here are some of the reasons why that is. First, there is much more variation within groups than between groups. This may seem like it's very different from that picture I just showed you with the three circles. But actually, there's more variation within so-called racial groups than between them. Most physical variation, about 94%, lies within so-called racial groups. Conventional geographic racial groupings differ from one another in only about 6% of their genes. This means that there is greater variation within racial groups than between them. So think about that. There is more genetic variation within so-called racial groups than between two different racial groups. So when you look back at this diagram of kind of the American folk notion of race with the three pictures, you'll see that that one on the right is wrong. The one on the left is the reality. And what you see here is that there's actually the pattern of DNA variation across populations shows a nested subset. African populations harbor some alleles or genetic variations that are absent from non-African populations. However, all of the alleles that are common in non-African populations are also common in African populations. So what that means basically is that we're all African. We all came from, our original ancestors came from Africa. And over time, that group went to different parts of the world and adapted in different ways. But what you see is actually that we are just one variation of each other rather than three separate groups. Another reason that race genetically is a mirage is that human variation is continuous, not discrete. So where do you draw the line between different skin colors, for instance? Like someone has decided to draw that line there. And for instance, if people are standing in a line short to tall, where you draw the line is a choice. So this is the idea that racial variations are on a spectrum, and someone has just arbitrarily decided to draw a line between these racial variations. Finally, or thirdly, the physical traits we think of as racial do not vary together. So this is a common misunderstanding. Knowing one trait does not predict the presence of others. So skin color varies from light in the temperate areas in the north to dark in the tropical areas in the south. Its intensity is not genetically related to nose shape, hair color, or hair type. You can have a tiny nose and you can be black. You can have a broad nose and be blonde. These things are not genetically vary together the way that most people think that they do. So put differently, not all dark-skinned people are lanky, not all white-skinned people are rounded, and physical variations in the human species have no meaning except the social ones that humans put on them. Finally, folk theories of race focus on skin color, but these differences are literally only skin deep. So you may have seen this map before. This map shows that the variations in skin color, which we so often connect to racial distinctions. Remember that the Linnaeus' idea of yellow, black, and white. These are actually, has to do with geography and UVR, not race. So skin color correlates closely with the amount of light and sun that different populations have adapted to. It is not genetically inherited in the sense that there's a population totally distinct of black-skinned people and a population totally distinct of white-skinned people. It just depends on where on the globe that person's ancestors have lived for the last couple thousand years. So to be anti-racist, according to Kendi, is to focus on ending the racism that shapes the mirages, not to ignore the mirages that shape people's lives. So it's really important. So by debunking the idea that race has a biological basis, it does not mean that we should ignore racism, because these ideas continue to shape people's lives. And we know now that from early child development studies that all human beings have the same capacity to learn any cultural human behavior. So this is really important. This means that human social behavior is not linked to race. It is not linked to skin color. It is not linked to genetics. Rather, it is our cultures who form who we are. Race is a social construct, but with real consequences. In the book, he has discussed other systems that support racism: public school education, healthcare, housing, jobs. I'm not going to get into that now, but I think it's important. And finally, I just wanted to mention a couple things about how this connects to my own research and how it connects to anthropology. So one of the key things I teach students is the idea of cultural relativism. And that is the idea that all cultures are equally meaningful to those who participate in them, and that different cultures cannot be graded or ranked. So this whole idea was a pushback against the idea that you could have different groups of people who were valued differently. And the idea here is that no culture is more complicated than any other, and no culture is more simple than any other. Rather, they're just different. And so we want to understand those differences, but we also don't map on those cultural differences to any kind of biology or idea of genetics, that any child can learn any culture. Really quickly, this is how this maps onto my own research. So one of the things I'm looking at, I'm an anthropologist who studies the Middle East. I also do some fieldwork here in Metro Detroit. And so I pay a lot of attention to Islamophobia, and I teach a course on Islamophobia. And there's racism in Islamophobia as well. One example were the 2015 ISIS attacks on Beirut and Paris that happened near to the same time, and you'll see that people cared a lot more about the Paris attacks and much less about the Beirut attacks. And this has been what is called an empathy gap, where Americans can see themselves as victims of the Paris attacks, but not of the Beirut attacks. So the question is, what underlies this? One thing that underlies it is an idea that Edward Said came up with called Orientalism. And this is the idea that the West has understood the Arab and Muslim world as its quintessential other. It's rendered exotic, irrational, and barbaric, and that these are associated almost like it is for African Americans with some kind of essential trait for Arabs that is correlated with their physical appearance and things like this. And to talk about this, we have begun to explore the concept of Islamophobia, which is literally translated to fear of Islam, but is more like anti-Muslim sentiment or something along that lines. And when we look at this, we need to think about Islamophobia not just as acts of, just the way that Kendi's doing in his book on anti-Black racism. We need to look at Islamophobia not just as acts of Islamophobia where someone calls someone a name or perpetuates an act of hate, like a hate crime, but also we need to look at the systems that hold up Islamophobia. Systems like U.S. foreign policies and warfare and sanctions and things like that. So that's basically my goal in this, and I thank you very much for listening to my short presentation on Chapter 4 of Kendi.